Okay, this is not, there's going to be some partisanship as a part of this presentation, but only from the respect of has to be partisan, it has to be political because we need a piece of legislation passed. And based on the political landscape of Ohio, you have to go about using the landscape and using the tools you have. We have a Republican-dominated, practically a supermajority in our General Assembly, and we have a Republican governor. So obviously our tactic is to move the Republicans. Every Democrat should be just as equally concerned about this, because the whole reason that education is held at the state level and is the largest appropriation in every state's budget, it's outlined in every state constitution, is because when you federalize education, you politicize it. And that is what we are finding. And that is why they've gone to national standards, is to get in this progressive agenda. And whether you're Republican or Democrat, no one wants someone else to be in charge of their child, especially someone from the DC area. So with that being said, I want to read an excerpt out of the beginning of Terrence Moore's book. And you'll know why by the time we get to this end of this presentation, because this is really what it's all about. This book is available outside. Dr. Terrence Moore is a professor of history at Hillsdale College. The meaning behind the title of this book, The Story Killers, is whoever controls the stories controls the regime. And that is time-tested and historically proved. But why is it prohibited? Asked the savage. In the excitement of meeting a man who had read Shakespeare, he had momentarily forgotten everything else. The controller shrugged his shoulders. Because it's old. That's the chief reason. We haven't any use for old things here. Even when they're beautiful? Particularly when they're beautiful. Beauty's attractive, and we don't want people to be attracted to old things. We want them to like the new things. Brave new world. We are living it. We are there. And it's because we have allowed our apathy to allow other people to take control of our lives, our liberty, our state, and our children. Yeah, you can. Look at it. Again, speaking to that fact that this is not one of the handouts that is on the tables. The first one is kind of like a 50-year summary of how did we get here. This is not. The worst thing you can think is that Common Core is just the latest education fad. I know a lot of teachers, when I talked to them this time last year, they're like, this will come and go like all the rest of them have. The problem is this is not a fad. All the other ones were not fads. They were the march that's been going on for 50 years. This, though, is the capstone. Common Core came into Ohio through Race to the Top, a federal bribe, a federal grant program, just like Obamacare has been flown in through the Medicaid expansion. It's all done with federal dollars, fiat currency, and debt. If you go back 50 years, it's 50 years ago this year, the War on Poverty, the Great Society, the Johnson administration, the birth of the federal footprint in education, as well as Medicaid, both were born of that piece of legislation, the Great Society. Their purpose, to help the underprivileged, poorest among us. The means, congressional legislation that superseded states' rights and usurped control. Funding were federal mandates, regulations, and grants. Those two programs now are the top two appropriations in every state budget, and they are ballooning. Both of them have been expanded excessively under the threat of crisis, particularly 2009. They managed to nationalize education and healthcare in one full swoop called the stimulus package. The economy was collapsing, urgency, we had to pass legislation to see what was in it. That occurred with both pieces of legislation, Obamacare and Common Core. The standards were not written when they were accepted. Bribery using federal debt, Race to the Top, and Medicaid expansion dollars. One size fits all, nationalized education and one-payer healthcare system. Coercion through federal dollars, destructing state sovereignty and free markets. And here's the kick. Circumventing state legislatures through use of federal grants and the controlling board. Every federal grant gets its legal basis out of the controlling board. And we watched what Governor Kasich did to go and do an end run around the state legislature and the budget outcome, which hence is we the people. They are our voice. So when he did that, he said, I don't care what you want, Ohioans. I want Medicaid expansion. When you circumvent the elected and the representatives, the people are not represented. Again, 1965, the piece of the War on Poverty, or the Great Society, it's called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. No Child Left Behind, Goals 2000, those two things are kind of notable. People have heard about those. Those were not individual exclusive pieces of federal education. Those were reauthorization of a 1965 Education Act. The feds were not a part of state-level education until 1965 with the ESA, as it's called. That's where Title I funding came in. Do I have any educators or administration in the room? Okay. The most notable reauthorizations, like I said, is the Clinton administration had Goals 2000, improving schools, and the George W. Bush No Child Left Behind. But again, those were not new pieces of legislation. Those weren't new ideas. They were the reauthorization of a 40-year-old plan. Clinton's administration, and again, a complete tie to, quote, Medicaid, one-payer, nationalizing education. On the education side, Mark Tucker has a letter that was so infamous, it's actually a part of the Federal Registry. 2 weeks after Bill and Hillary were elected, he sent a 19-page letter to Hillary Clinton outlining what he believed needed to be done in education. This is an excerpt from that very letter. To remold the entire American system into a seamless web that literally extends from cradle to grave and is the same system for everyone, coordinated by a system of labor market boards at the local, state, and federal level, where curriculum and job matching will be handled by counselors, assessing the integrated computer-based program. That is 1994. Actually, 1992 is the letter. That became Clinton's education plan. But he was never able to get the national standard piece to it. But those 4 assurances right there in that paragraph are Common Core, because that's always been the agenda. It's just taken them 50 years to get here. The Goals 2000, the Clinton administration, the objective at that point was, how do we get the teachers to teach what we want them to teach? That is where standards-based reform was born. Prior to 1994 and the reauthorization with Goals 2000, there wasn't standards-based reform. Myself and anybody older than me was not educated K through 12 with academic standards. You had community level standards, standards set by your local school boards, your elected representatives, who then dictated down to your superintendent, your principal, and so forth. You did not have Columbus, and you certainly didn't have the feds telling you how to teach in your school system. The reason standards-based reform works is 2 reasons. One, who can argue with better standards, right? It's the progressive way. Label it, redefine a word, and you can't be argued with that way. So they call them standards, even though they were really a curriculum framework, if you go back far enough in the documentation. And standards then drive the assessment, which then drives the curriculum. So standards-based reform, while it sounds wonderful, all it is the ability for the feds or whomever's in charge of the standards to drive the outcome. It simply determines the curriculum, which is exactly what it was supposed to do. And that's where this phenomenon that we've accepted as a common practice of teaching to the test came from. In the terms of the historical timeline of education, this is a new occurrence. Standards-based reform was able to be brought into the states and embraced because the other piece that they found to do with the 1994 legislation was they congressionally, part of the package with Goals 2000 and School to Work was the ability for Congress passed legislation that allowed the feds to offer grants to the states for their state-led reform. Now that sounds counterintuitive for a reason, because the grantee does not determine the criteria for a grant, the grantor does. So by default, that was the feds' way of financing their agenda and knowing that the states would do whatever they could to get additional financing. Because if you look, the number one objective was to bypass all elected officials on school boards and in state legislatures by making federal grants flow to the governor. Again, why? Because a governor doesn't have the same objective as a state legislator. A governor is a CEO. When a CEO is handed money to put on their balance sheet, they'll figure out what they're going to do with it. They are not going to turn away money. And so this worked like a charm, and they worked exactly like they thought it would. This money comes in, it seeds the federal agenda. It's like startup cash. 3 years later, the state is left to maintain that program. And the state legislature has no idea what happened because the appropriation for that was a federal grant that they have not seen prior to being now introduced with new legislation. You just notice the second one was to build a computer database. The third one was national standards and national testing. Okay, so that's where we're at. The race to the top, money went right to the governor. We've built a longitudinal student data system. We've got national standards. We've got a national test. And they even added another one that Mark Tucker didn't have in there, which is the feds now evaluate our teachers. So once the states are bribed with federal dollars, our budgets are ballooned. The federal agenda gets seeded into the state through the bribes of the grants. Once it's seeded, the state is further hooked to the federal purse to maintain the program. The fact that it's special revenue fund, not general revenue fund, means our legislators don't look at it until it's their turn to pay for it. And because the grants go through the controlling board at the beginning. So this federal startup cash, these grants, are what has allowed this thing to progress for the last 20 years to the point that since 2000, in the last 15 years, at the end of this biennium, our state appropriation has doubled. It has nothing to do with your property taxes. This is just at the state level funding. We have gone from $6.8 billion annually to over $12 billion by the end of the 2015 budget. And the federal footprint of our state education budget has tripled. 20% of our budget comes from the feds. George W. Bush came in 2002, and when he reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, it was called No Child Left Behind. And some of you may remember that was actually legislation, or that criteria for that was pretty much written by Ted Kennedy. It doubled down on standard-based reform. It had burdensome unfunded mandates, inane accountability measures. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. The focus turned even more so from students to test. And its failure is what drove the states also drove them to Common Core and Race to the Top, because part of the carrot with Race to the Top, besides the billions of dollars, was a waiver from No Child Left Behind. So they've traded one set of strings for another. When Obama came in, his idea was to radically change No Child Left Behind. And he did that through the use of the stimulus dollars. And with that, he said, you adopt Common Core standards, and you adopt these assurances with Race to the Top, and I'll give you a waiver, and this is what you need to do. Common Core basically are those 4 assurances we saw from 1992. National copyrighted academic standards, federally dictated data mining of our children and families without consent, without restriction, federally mandated teacher and principal evaluations, and a national assessment that drives our local curriculum, and now is determining Ohio's graduation criteria. Those 4 assurances are all you need to completely transform American education. And for those of you that remember, that was his objective, to transform our country. And again, whether you agree with that agenda or you don't, you would have to be willing to accept that you no longer will have any control over your future, your child's future, or your state's future. There are 3 federal statutes, laws, that this violates. The feds cannot be involved in curriculum, instructional materials, or assessments. They violate all 3 of their own federal statutes. 2 of those statutes were put in by Democrat Secretaries of Education. Getting back to the crises of the recession, when that $1 trillion stimulus, that wasn't just a shot in the arm for the other side, so to speak. That went far, far deeper and broader than we could have ever imagined. Everything I find, if it wasn't financed through the stimulus dollars, was financed through Bill Gates. Everything about Common Core. One of the pieces that doesn't get talked about much is that before Race to the Top, there was a $53 billion carve-out from the stimulus that was just handed over to the U.S. Department of Education. And that's what they used to basically keep teachers employed. It was going to save the education system. Well, what they did was they put those same 4 general assurances and tied them to the state stabilization dollars. So at the first stage, every governor in the country agreed to this, including Rick Perry of Texas and McDonald's predecessor also did. So when you hear that there's some states that didn't do Common Core, they didn't do Race to the Top. For all intent and purposes, they're doing Common Core because they did that to get their billions of dollars on the front end. So the state fiscal stabilization funds of $53 billion, it was doled out across all 50 states, depending on your population, your student population, I should say, were those 4 assurances. The common set of standards that had yet to be written, the longitudinal student data system, teacher and principal evaluations per federal guidelines, and a national assessment consortia. You had to do those 4, assure the feds, Arne Duncan particularly, that you would do those 4 things in order to get those billions of dollars in state stabilization funds. Race to the Top was $4.35 billion carved out of that $53 billion for this competition. It took those 4 general assurances and put them into detail. The rubric is on the 2/3 right-hand side of this. And it outlines, it's just like your 3rd grader science project. This is what you need to do, and if you do it really well, we'll give you this many points. Okay? Ohio did really well. In fact, Ohio and Florida, the 2 must-win states of 2012, were the 2 top winners for their population size. But if you'll notice, down the left-hand side, I've pointed out where you got the most points on a single line item. The single line item that received the most points was the local education associations, which are your local school districts. 65 points. And basically what that tells you is, I want to know how you're going to sell this to your local districts. If you do that really well, you'll win the most points for that prize. Because if you don't get your local districts on board, you're never going to get this implemented. So there's a lot of bribes for that. The second one was great teachers and leaders, as they like to call it, which was 58 points. That was, how are you going to tie every single child's assessment score for every single class to the teacher that taught that class? Because the teacher's evaluation now is 50% dependent on that child's assessment score. Every single score in every single classroom. The other line item that's on here that is pretty telling when it comes to the agenda, it talks about ensuring equitable distribution of teachers. And that is outlined in many reports, and the idea behind that is it's this whole word equity. Not fair, equitable. So it's not fair, in their minds, it's not equitable for the teachers in the suburbs, the best teachers to be in the suburbs, rather. They should have to go down and teach in the urban schools, because that's what's equitable. That's the only reason the children in the urban schools aren't doing as well as the suburbs, is because they don't have the best teachers, right? So again, what does this do? This disincentivizes your teachers to be in the top 10%. So this is just more, massaging what happens literally in the classroom, right here in Cincinnati, at the local level. DC has actually had sort of fingerprints on what happens to your teacher's evaluation, where she's going to teach next year, and where her evaluation in terms of the assessment because of the students. The nucleus, again, is the standards. So when you hear this coming out of Columbus, oh, well, we're gonna protect that data. That's not a problem. We're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, we're gonna drop the assessment. All that's meaningless. Because as we know in standards-based reform, all the nucleus, the stick itself are the standards. Because if you control the standards, you automatically control everything else. Bill Gates has been in Ohio since 2000 with the Taft administration. Taft took the first multi-million-dollar grant from Bill Gates. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason also why there's a lot of focus from those around the country who are a part of this effort to repeal and stop Common Core, why they have a real interest in Ohio. It's because Ohio is politically the state, as we know. We are the bellwether. So even Indiana's effort, quite honestly, was not successful. They still have Common Core. But if it had been, it's kind of inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Because Indiana isn't going to change who sits in the White House. But Ohio does. So everybody's focus is on Ohio, whether you're trying to keep Common Core in or trying to get Common Core out. That's why Bill Gates started here. He financed the Beyond Tinkering Reform recommendation that Governor Strickland based this on and put into House Bill 1, his last budget bill. House Bill 1 required the state board to revise the state standards by 6/30 of 10. Okay, the state budget, that would have been 6/30 of 2009. Okay, all that was in there was that they were going to adopt college and career ready standards, and they had to do it by 6/30 of 10. What's really telling about that is that's exactly what ended up being the deadline of the Race to the Top application and adopting the common standards. A name that is throughout, besides Bill Gates, that's throughout Ohio documentation at the state board level, at the personnel management level, is Linda Darling Hammond. And if you're not familiar with that name, go home and look her up. She is a hard leftist. She is part of the Chicago cabal, as I call it. She is best friends with Bill Ayers. She is a colleague of Valerie Jarrett, the chief of staff to President Obama. She graduated out of the Teachers College at Columbia University, which was started by John Dewey. Everything about her, it's almost like satirical that it is, she encompasses everything that we know to be wrong with how we want our education system to work. The national assessment. That is the data path and the linchpin in terms of the kind of the transition between what the standards are and what gets taught in the classroom, because they both default down to the assessment. Again, against federal statute, your tax dollars or our debt dollars paid to set up these two national consortia, $330 million of the stimulus package. There are two governing documents related to the park assessment in our case. We are a member state of the Park Consortia, and we have a memorandum of understanding with the Park Board, and it starts out saying this: Ohio will address any such barriers through standard practices and protocols in order to implement the full summative assessment system by 1415. This will include, but is not limited to, promulgating changes to existing codes and regulations, and requesting required adjustments to existing budget appropriations. That's the full load right there. That's everything. We'll change our code. We will increase our budget if necessary. We'll do whatever is necessary, whatever the Park Consortia tells us we need to do to be in compliance. We signed off on that. Our state board president, our governor at the time, and quite honestly, Governor Kasich had to agree within 90 days of taking office to also accept those assurances. In turn, though, that is the data collection point. Park also signed an agreement, only their agreement was with the U.S. Department of Education. And their agreement begins with, because the Secretary of Education has determined that substantial communication, coordination, and involvement between the U.S. Department of Ed and the recipient is necessary to carry out a successful project. So, as you can see right there, those two governing documents determine everything. Arne Duncan is the contractor on this effort, period. He manages all of it. Everybody's at his beck and call, or he turns off the faucet. Whether it's funding, whether it's your No Child Left Behind waiver, whatever it is. He's got the stick, he's already given you the carrot, and now he's in control. So again, remember that. Okay, the standards are it, because the standards equal the assessment, which equals the curriculum. And what gets tested will get taught. And it certainly will now, because 50% of every teacher's evaluation is dependent upon that child's assessment score. Let me see if I can get this. Bill Gates in 2009, addressing a body of legislators, there's a clip I'll play here, but he talks about this very thing, which we hear ad nauseum out of Columbus, that these are just standards, these are just basic bare minimums. You know, no one should be concerned about this. This has nothing to do with curriculum, it has nothing to do with the test. Well, Bill Gates says different. Sorry. This worked perfectly, doesn't it?
You're muted.
Maybe I don't have this plugged in all the way. I apologize.
The curriculum will line up as well. And it will unleash a powerful market of people providing services for better teaching. For the first time, there'll be a large uniform base of customers looking at using products that can help every kid learn and every teacher get better. Imagine having the people who create great online video games applying their intelligence to online tools that pull kids in and make algebra and other subjects fun.
He starts out by saying, basically, that Arne Duncan has come up with these common standards, and once the assessments are aligned with the standards, the curriculum will line up as well. And that's when we'll know that we've been successful. And that's what's going to unleash these market forces. This is not about education. This is about market forces. This is about developing a managed workforce. This is about cogs in the machine. This is not about children. And while as detestable as I find Bill Gates, there's a reason Bill Gates is in charge of your child's education in their classroom. And it's because our legislators and our representatives have failed us. Bill Gates should not be allowed to be in the classroom. We have laws that prevent that, but we don't have anybody following the laws. This is a report out of June of 2009 as well, right when our budget was being signed, that adopted de facto Common Core. This is a report that was a result of a symposium from Bill Gates. That is his title, not mine, a multi-state human capital development data system. It's a 3-page report that outlines all of the wonders of what they had just pulled off with getting these states to sign up on these assurances with these standards. It talks about developing the human capital for the state stakeholder. That's your children, and that's the state. That is not you as parents. Failure of 3 rounds of federal grants, but they figured out how to get the states to do it. The stimulus dollars. The stock and flow of human capital. How they're going to disaggregate the data to shape policy and equalize outcomes. That disaggregate, that means student level data. Because they cannot intervene and do something unless they know who Johnny is. And if you think you're going to link Johnny's math score from 3rd Bell with Mrs. Jones, you have that data. It's impossible to do that type of linkage and not know who that child is. Agenda-driven special interest. Okay, this is not citizens or legislators driving this. These are special interests that have bought their way in. Further proof. This is right now Battelle for Kids About Us page. Battelle for Kids is a perfect example of the corporatized foundation, as I call it. George Soros perfected it, and Bill Gates has used that methodology to come in and own American education. Battelle for Kids has if you can see over here the arrow, that's a link to a video called Transforming American Education. That word transforming is constant in everything you read about Common Core. Down below, their expertise is Common Core, educator effectiveness, and human capital. This is a foundation for kids, right? This foundation is involved in every single STEM program in the country. This is not, again, about education. This is about control, and it's about developing human capital. The number one myth or lie out of Columbus has been that this is a state-led effort. Well, this is an image right off their public license page at commoncorestandards.org. It clearly states on the public license page that the NGA Center and the Chief Council of State School Officers shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and developers of the Common Core state standards. No claims to the contrary shall be made. Now, why do you copyright anything? Twofold: to keep someone else from capitalizing on it, and to keep someone from modifying it. If Ohio contributed to these standards, we don't own the copyright, and we don't. Also on the public license page, people say, well, we don't have Common Core, we have Ohio Core, which has now been renamed for about the 4th time to the new Ohio Learning Standards, even though they're 4 years old. It clearly states, per the license, that in order to avoid acknowledging the copyright, if you adopt the standards in whole, that's their language, you can rename them. So basically, if you adopt our copyrighted standards in whole, you can act like they're yours, which is exactly what we did, because you can't find Common Core, those two words, in Ohio Revised Code. It's Ohio Core, or it's 21st Century Learning Skills, or it's College and Career Readiness, but it sure isn't Common Core. Additionally, on the public license page, in all capital letters, for you attorneys in the room as well, it includes a legal disclaimer saying they cannot be held liable for any damages resulting from failure of the standards. In the second page of their introduction, they clearly outline that this is a living set of standards, just like our living Constitution. As new research is conducted, we will evaluate the implementation of the Common Core standards, and we plan to revise the standards on a set review cycle. That's why that language in that PARC consortia agreement is critical. Because by the time all of our districts get caught up, get all the textbooks in, well, next July they may decide, these ELA standards aren't producing what we wanted. So we're going to revise the standards. So Ohio's going to have to revise their budget appropriation, or revise whatever they have to do to be in compliance with that agreement. We are forever at the mercy of the copyright holders at this point. Myth 2, local control. But just from a practical sense, it's impossible to have anybody locally directing what's going on, but yet have that assessed at a national level. That's just, from practical purposes, it's impossible. We don't have local control, and we haven't for the last 20 years that we've been under state-based or standards-based reform, because the feds and the state are dictating to your superintendents what has to be done in order to keep their grade for their building and their district up, and to keep the funding without question. And additionally, there is a school options table that's out there at the Ohio Department of Education, and it clearly states what each type of school option has to do. A public school, a chartered school, a chartered non-public, which is what 80% of your private schools are. And it clearly states out there that a public school or public charter has to adopt or abide by whatever is currently the federal level, whether it's No Child Left Behind, whether it's Common Core, and the state level standards. And you're required to give all of the state assessments. There's no option there. This is a slide from February of 2012. Stan Hefner was our state superintendent of education at the time. And And you can see, this is talking about next school year, the 14-15 school year, which is the end, so to speak, of this phase-in of Common Core and all the other three assurances. And it talks about implementation of local curriculum and instruction. There's no, we'll give you model curriculum. No, you're going to implement local curriculum and instruction aligned to the Common Core and state revised standards. You're going to have national and state assessments that are fully operational. PARCC has to be in place by next school year. And accountability for teachers has to be based on these new standards. This is some excerpts out of a letter that went to the Ontario School District, which is just a little bit north of Mansfield. Their superintendent or director of instruction sent a letter to the ODE and asked, what are the implications if we decide to execute our local control you keep telling us we have? And they came back very sternly and said, well, here's all the punitive damage that we will do to you. They talk about the alignment of the academic content standards to the assessments, and the end of course examinations are going to automatically put you at a disadvantage. Your students are going to suffer. Your teachers are going to suffer. Your district's going to suffer. So you've been fairly warned. If you want to go rogue, that's fine, but this is what lies ahead. A punitive punishment at every level for every player in the system, from child to teacher to building. Myth 3, that the data is protected. Along with filing our Race to the Top application, which is with a deadline of January of 2010, December of 2009, there was a bill, House Bill 290, that originated in the House. It was a one-paragraph bill, very generic, that allowed ROTC candidates not to have to take physical education class. Well, the problem was, in order to be able to sign our Race to the Top application and have our Attorney General at the time, Richard Cordray, sign off that there were no legal barriers to the feds getting our student data, we had some legislation we needed to pass to take away those barriers. That became House Bill 290. At the time, Senator John Husted was in the Senate. He cut and pasted his bill, which was Senate Bill 180, which was going nowhere. Cut and pasted into 290, which was a gimme.